This is it, guys. It's been a long time coming. It's been a heck of a journey, but this is finally the end of the Aeneid. Or is it? Okay. This is going to be our last episode on Virgil's Aeneid. What a delight it has been to go through this poem with you. I feel like I've rediscovered it myself. I said when we started out that I loved this poem in high school. It was one of the first things I ever read in the original Latin. It just swept me away, and I was so passionately involved in it. And then as I went to grad school, I became more of what they call a Hellenist. That is, I was working on more Greek subjects, and I just fell more and more deeply in love with Homer. And I sort of got seduced by the old narrative that Homer was the truly great epic poet, and Virgil was just kind of copying down his notes. And I basically left Virgil behind. So coming back to Virgil in this way and reappreciating and rediscovering how magnificent this poem is, what a sublime work of art, what a carefully crafted work of art and commentary on the specific moment of Augustan Rome. All of that has been just a joy to me to rediscover, and I hope you've enjoyed it too and gotten something out of this as well. But all good things must come to an end, so we will be concluding our series on the Aeneid today. But the big question is still going to be, are we concluding the Aeneid as it was meant to be concluded? Or did Virgil die before he could finish the story? Does this thing cut off so abruptly that we have to conclude Virgil meant for there to be something more? We do know that he left the poem unfinished, and this is a very weird, unsettling ending to this war between the Rutulians and the Trojans that will ultimately cinch the victory for Aeneas and for the future of Rome. Last time we left it in a bit of a cliffhanger moment and we weren't sure what was going to happen. Now we are going to find out that, in fact, Aeneas is going to be victorious, but we're still going to be left with a little bit of a cliffhanger feeling. And so, one of the things that people have been debating for a long, long time is whether the poem was supposed to end this way. And it gets folded up into the more modern debate about whether Virgil was really as pro Augustus as he seemed to his contemporaries, or was he sneaking in a critique of Augustan Rome and of empire? Is this a bleak, dark poem about Augustan totalitarianism and an underhanded kind of attack on everything that seems to be great about Rome? We are in my house watching the anime TV show Demon Slayer, Kimetsu no Yaiba, if you do the Japanese. I don't know if anybody who listens to this podcast is also kind of a Japan nerd like me, but if you like this show, you might have seen or you might have noticed something funny about anime shows in general and about Demon Slayer in particular, which is that they kind of always end halfway through an episode. Like, the commercial break comes at the conclusion of a story, and then every episode begins a new story, and then the end of the episode is like suspended in midair. What's going to happen next? Because they obviously have to keep you coming back for the next story and the next story and the next part of what's going on. And the end of the Aeneid kind of feels to some people like the end of an anime TV show, like the end of a Demon Slayer episode, where definitely something has been rounded out. There is an end now, a decisive victory for Aeneas, but there's all sorts of stuff that we should expect that we would think would be coming next if this were kind of a normal traditional epic. And if this were just a straightforward, direct praise for Augustus, there's a lot of stuff that we might expect after the death of Turnus, who you will recall is the big rival of Aeneas. He dies at the end of this poem. We're going to talk all about how he dies, the way he dies, and then we're going to talk about whether Virgil really meant for this to be the last word or whether something else was coming. I really have to make one more plug for you guys to go away and read this poem. If you haven't been reading along with us, I just, at some point you have to close out this series, and we are getting to the end of the story, but there's so much stuff that we can't even cover. There's all kinds of little Easter eggs and fun things that get thrown in there, and side quests and all these mini adventures. We're not even really going to talk that much about Camilla, one of my favorite characters. She's kind of this almost Amazon. She's a Volscian maiden who's fighting on the opposite side of Aeneas. She's fighting with the Rutulians against the Trojans, but she's one of these noble adversaries, a lot like the Trojan heroes in the Iliad who fight against the Greeks. There's a lot of them that have this very admirable level of heroism, and Camilla is kind of like that in the Aeneid. She's also like all of these great femme fatale figures from Greek mythology and history, like Artemisia, who fought on the side of the Persians. Camilla is this amazing. She's betrothed, or she's rather promised to Diana, who is the goddess of the hunt. And when I say betrothed, I mean she's never going to get married. So she's a maiden, and she was promised to the goddess of the hunt by her father, who was fleeing from his enemies, and he was carrying the infant Camilla, this baby girl, along with him. And her father had to get her across this river. So he tied her to a spear and threw her across the river. This is sort of like a Cartoon Network kind of image in my mind of this baby girl whizzing across the river Amasenus, which is, of course, sounds like Amazon, right? And it gives us this impression that this is a woman who is going to be a mighty warrior, and she grows up indeed to be one of the true greats. She fights against the Trojans, but ultimately is killed by Aruns, one of the pro-Trojan fighters. So that's like a whole little side episode that we get. We get a bunch of different. I talked about Nisus and Euryalus last time, and these are all just phenomenal little scenes, vignettes. They have all sorts of resonance for Virgil's original readers and for us. But to really round out this poem, the character we have to talk most about is Pallas. I mentioned him last time. I sort of brushed over him and said that we were going to come back around to him. You may remember Evander is the king, the Greek king living in Italy. And he is a major figure, not just in the Aeneid, but in mythology generally, as the man who brought Greek culture to Italy. So by making an alliance with Evander, Aeneas is basically uniting his Trojan heritage to the wonders of the Greek world and claiming for Rome, for what will become Rome, access to the patrimony of the Greek world, really to civilization, because the Greeks, according to the Romans, and also according to many other people, kind of by the day that Virgil was writing, the Greeks really were the pinnacle of civilization. They were kind of like the French, if you want to think of them that way, the height of sophistication. Or really, if you think of Americans as Romans, if we are the kind of modern Roman Empire, then our Greeks would be the British, right? They were powerful before us, and they always have a degree of sophistication and history and elegance to them. They are the supervillains and the sophisticates in all of our movies, right? Americans love James Bond. We love these kind of suave, sophisticates with British accents. This is like a picture that we have in our head, and we have this sort of inferiority complex, sort of superiority complex. We think of ourselves as like having bucked the British rule. And I have this tank top that I wear to the gym sometimes that says WTF is a kilogram, as in, we've like the metric system is for those pansies in Europe and in Britain, but also at the same time, of course, we think that the Brits are really cool, even though we don't totally want to admit that. And we have this complicated relationship to them. That was the same relationship that the Romans had with the Greeks. They thought of them on one level as these sort of suspicious, silver-tongued orators. On another level, they admired them as the originators of culture and these wonderful, they had the kind of, they were the keepers of poetry like Homer's. And all of that has been part of the dialogue between Virgil and Homer throughout this poem. Now, Virgil has, after accomplishing the task of writing a great Roman epic, or rather, as he is bringing that task to its completion, he is staking a claim for Rome to the mantle of culture. He's saying we are the true heirs now of Greek civilization. And that's part of the point of Evander being there. It's part of the point of the alliance between them, that they fight against the Rutulians and against Turnus together. And another of the many things that this alliance does for Virgil is it creates a Patroclus Achilles situation. If you listen to my series on the Iliad, then we talked all about Patroclus and Achilles. This was this very intimate friendship, which has later been thought of as maybe a sexual relationship, but I argued is really not a sexual relationship in Homer's original poem. And the thing that brings the Iliad to its conclusion, the catalyst of the last series of events, is the death of Patroclus. And Virgil has to find some way of mirroring or reflecting those events in this mini Iliad that he's writing. And so he has to introduce a Patroclus character that will get Aeneas into the beast mode that he needs to be in to win the war. Because you will remember that when Patroclus dies, he goes out, he fights on Achilles' behalf. Achilles has left the battle because of his mayness, his rage. He doesn't want to support this Greek army that has deprived him of his glory. He's angry at Agamemnon, and therefore the Greeks are dying, and Patroclus takes Achilles' armor and wears it into battle, and then is killed by Hector. And Achilles is so overcome with fury at this, and with grief, and with remorse at having allowed his dear friend to go forth into battle on his behalf, that he finally re-enters the battle. And it's his utter rage at Hector. It's this all-consuming desire for revenge that drives him to move the battle forward on behalf of the Greeks and to kill the greatest hero of the Trojans. Many of those things are now going to get mirrored here, but in significantly, importantly different ways. So there's an interesting thing going on where when you read the Iliad or when you listen to the Iliad, there's this funny effect where Patroclus feels younger than Achilles, even though he is actually sort of Achilles' guardian. He's older than Achilles, and he has helped to raise Achilles. But Achilles is such a juggernaut, such a huge and powerful character, that Patroclus kind of becomes like his little protected Achilles sort of becomes the guardian of Patroclus. And so when Patroclus dies, Achilles feels responsible. Now, in the Aeneid, that relationship becomes literal, and Pallas is no longer the guardian figure in any respect, but he is the ward. He's this young guy that is the son of Evander, and he gets passed off to Aeneas, and Aeneas kind of takes him in as his son. So it almost increases the pathos, the pain, when Pallas is ultimately killed by Turnus. So Turnus here is basically the Hector figure. He's the enemy fighter. Pallas is the Patroclus figure, and Aeneas is the Achilles. And until now, Aeneas has really not been defined by rage in the way that Achilles has been defined by rage. Remember, the Iliad opens with Maenus, sing the rage, right? This poem, the Aeneid, does not begin with rage, but with arms and a man, right? It's that combination of the Odyssey and the Iliad that we started with. But Virgil does not take that rage and make it central to Aeneas' character. And we're going to see why in just a second. But one major reason, obviously, is that Achilles is famously this deeply flawed, complicated, morally difficult character. And Aeneas has really not been. He has had his struggles and his challenges. He began in despair. He's moved now toward taking up the mantle of his destiny. But he's defined by his piety and his sense of duty, his honor, and his sense that he's obligated, whatever else he may want to do, he's obligated to his hearth, his family, his household gods, and to his destiny, right? So Aeneas is not notably a very angry character, and it would kind of be out of the picture of what Virgil wants to draw. It would be inappropriate for Aeneas to be defined by rage in the way that Achilles is defined by rage. And yet he also has to be drawn into this Achilles role. He has to kind of take it on and play this part in the way that he's played a lot of other parts. He's played the part of the doomed lover with Dido. He's played the part of the wandering soldier like Odysseus. He's now going to have to play the part of the warrior and do what needs to be done to brutally execute on this ultimate destiny that he has, right? He doesn't want to do that. He's not portrayed as loving warfare, or he would like to peacefully just found Rome. And yet he is being basically thrust again into this role against his will, the role of the berserker warrior. And Pallas is there kind of to do that. That's one of his major roles in the story. But it's very, very different in that sense from what happens with Achilles and Patroclus. Virgil, as always, has taken this story template from Homer, and then he's given it to us in this kind of transformed way. And the differences tell us everything about what he's trying to say, right? He's saying, yes, Aeneas, my hero, the embodiment of Rome, is a warrior and can do what needs to be done and can, when the time comes, execute his enemies, just like Augustus had to beat Antony at the Battle of Actium. You'll remember from last time. But that's not who he is. His character is not defined by rage in the way that Achilles' character is defined by rage. Aeneas is more balanced. He has to take on these roles, but he has to take on all of them at different times to fully embody everything that Virgil wants to say Rome is. And so he very carefully kind of Virgil very carefully readjusts the elements of this story, takes even the suggestion of a homosexual relationship completely out of it. That suggestion is kind of transposed onto Nisus and Euryalus, these other two characters that we talked about last time. And this is just a surrogate father-son relationship. Pallas really takes his place beside Iulus as the ward or the protected boy that Aeneas feels responsible for. And in that sense, of course, it's incredibly moving for Augustus because, as we've talked about many times, Augustus did have a kind of foster son in Marcellus who did die and fail to become his heir in the way that he might have liked him to be. A lot of people thought. So this is all, these pieces are being arranged, set up by Virgil to give us just exactly the dynamic that we need when, in Book 10, Turnus kills Pallas, which is exactly what we would expect if we've read the Iliad. And this kind of gets us onto the track to complete this war. Turnus kills Pallas. Aeneas is full of grief and sorrow. There's a very moving speech that he makes where he talks about how he now has to send this corpse back to Evander, the poor old man who entrusted him with his son. And we've been deprived, he even says, Iulus, that is my own son, Aeneas' own son, has been deprived of a kind of co-heir or friend and somebody that could have gone with him into this future of Rome. That's all cut off now. And it's left kind of open to us to say, well, why does this move Aeneas so deeply? But I think if we know what was going on with Augustus, we can see, yeah, he had these hopes for Marcellus. Aeneas has these hopes for Pallas. And there's also a sense, I think, of the Greek world being somehow irrevocably injured and wounded in the process of the founding of Rome. Because on the one hand, as we said, Virgil wants to claim Greek patrimony, Greek culture for the Romans. On the other hand, he recognizes that the age of Homer and those heroes and the age even of Athens in its greatness has passed away. And this is part of the expansion of Rome, was taking over Greece and superseding Greece. And so to have this character who kind of represents the Greek world be killed and create this void at the heart of the story and the heart of the hero is also poignant for the Romans more generally, not just for Augustus. And so now we have a scene of mourning, which is another thing that we get in the Iliad a lot. But from now on, we're going to have scenes of rage. And this is what kindles the fury, the bitterness and anger in Aeneas that Achilles shows sort of throughout the poem. And this happens, he's described as burning. He's described as full of bitterness, acher. There's a profound sense that there is now a kind of like, you won't like him when he's angry. Like, you've awakened or broken something in Aeneas now by killing this boy that wasn't broken before. Before, it was kind of all's fair in war. Obviously, Turnus is causing trouble where he doesn't have to, but it's Alecto and Juno who sort of spurred him on to that. Now, now he's really done it, right? Now there's going to be hell to pay. And it's this that ends us up as the battle proceeds in the final scene that we need to spend kind of most of our attention on here today. So I've translated the ultimate final passages from this poem. Aeneas, like Achilles, goes and basically achieves what Achilles achieves, and he gets Turnus at his mercy, in just the same way as Hector ends up having to beg at the knees of Achilles. Turnus is left helpless, begging, actually not even begging for his life. So this is the section that we're going to read now, is this very last series of exchanges between Turnus and Aeneas after Aeneas has all but cinched the victory. So here's Turnus. He's on the ground. He's helpless before the conquering hero Aeneas, who has now all but given himself over to rage over the death of Pallas. And here's my translation. Abject and prone, his eyes and hand held out in prayer, he said, I ask no mercy. This is what I've earned. Equidem merui nec deprecor. I deserve this, and I'm not going to try to pray it away. I ask no mercy. This is what I've earned. So press your fate's advantage. If my father's grief can touch your heart, I pray, you had a father once, like mine, the Lord Anchises. Pity Daunus' age. Give me, or give my body, plundered of its light, back to my people. You're the victor, I'm your victim, palms stretched out for all Ausonia to see. Now, there's a lot that is happening here. First of all, of course, it's pitiable that Turnus doesn't even go so far as to ask for mercy. We're supposed to think, I believe, that he would like mercy. He's hoping against hope that Aeneas will have pity, but all he really asks for is at least give my dead body back, right? He's asking, and this is key, he's asking for what Hector eventually gets. So if you remember in the Iliad, Achilles kills Hector. He is then still so consumed with rage and vengeance that he mutilates his body, or tries to. He pins his heels together, drags him around the walls of Troy, drags him trailing from his chariot, does all sorts of brutal things to Hector's body. The gods are appalled. He's obviously, his rage has gone far beyond the limits, the metron in Greek of what is human and what's acceptable, even though, of course, Hector has killed Patroclus. It's far too much, and this is where the menace, the rage that is the poem's subject, has to find its end. And if you'll recall, there is a very powerful and surprising scene in which Priam goes to Achilles, the father of Hector, the old king, begs Achilles for the chance to bury his son's body. He says, please just give me Hector's body back and stop mutilating it. And then Achilles breaks down and weeps. Priam and Achilles weep together, and Achilles remembers his own father. When he sees Priam, he remembers his own father and he relents and gives the body back. And so this rage that has defined the poem is finally extinguished in grief. We talked a lot about that when we talked about the Iliad. That is exactly what Turnus is asking for. He's saying, just do the ending of the Iliad, right? Okay, I know that I'm Hector. I see now that this battle has been resolved, that the fates have decided in your favor. And he talks about this, utere sorte tua. Enjoy the full fruition of this fate that you've got, this lot that the destiny has plotted out for you. All of that is yours. Just play the role to the end and think of your father in the way that Achilles thought of his father. When you think of my father in the way that Priam came, right? There's this kind of weird overlay going on where he's basically saying, like, we've gotten now to the ending of the story. Let's just do that ending. Let's do grief, right? maybe it would be nice if you could not kill me, I think we're sort of supposed to get that as the subtext, but really all he's asking for is the ending that Hector gets in the Iliad. You're the victor, I'm your victim, palm stretched out for all Ausonia to see. The woman's yours. Lavinia will be your wife. Don't drag your hatred out. Ulterius ne tende odiis. So again, that idea of carrying anger beyond the limits of what is appropriate and acceptable to the within the idea of piety and the human that the Greek epic has. That's what's being invoked here, very intentionally. This is like pretty obvious. We're supposed to see this. Flashing lights. It's time now, everybody, for the end of the Iliad to happen. Everything's going according to plan. And then this happens. The speech ends. Turnus stops talking. We turn abruptly to Aeneas, who is being invited to basically take this and run with it, right? It's an easy opportunity for him to draw a nice, neat line on his anger. And even maybe go one step further than Achilles, surpass Achilles in mercy or generosity, right? We might think, okay, Aeneas is supposed to be even better, right? Even more noble, even more pious than Achilles. He's been put into this role of the rageful hero, the rageful warrior. But that's not really who he is, right? He also has this respect for the gods and for proportion. And surely at this moment, his role should be to commute the sentence, to call off the death, right? And not to act like Achilles. But here's what we get. He stood ablaze in arms, Aeneas, eyes all wild, holding back his hand. Again and yet again, the speech deterred his choice to finish what he started. So, looks like maybe gonna hold his hand back right up until the very moment. I mean, this poem, it's like, even though everything that happens is technically destined, it keeps you guessing right up until the very moment. That's when it appeared. Ill-fated and well-known, slung high across his back, the baldric and the gleaming studded belt of Pallas, bludgeoned boy, which Turnus took and cast across his shoulders as a show of victory. He looked a moment at this monument of grief. He drank its savage pain, was lit aflame with rage. You, clad in spoils from the ones within my care, shall you escape me? Pallas wounds you now. Here, Pallas slaughters you as sacrifice and punishment. He claims your filthy blood to answer for your guilt. And as he spoke, he drove the blade beneath his chest with fevered strokes. He groaned, his limbs went slack with chill, his life, judged worthless, scurried to the Shadowlands. End of poem. End of anime episode. That's it. That's how the thing closes. Incredibly stark, jagged, serrated edge of an ending. What to say? Well, first of all, there is an element of this which is taken from the Iliad. We know that after Hector killed Patroclus, he stripped the body of its armor, and this was an incentive, a kind of spur to rage for Achilles. This moment, incredibly tense moment where Aeneas is about to maybe relent, and then he sees it, and we get this wonderful enjambment, this hyperbaton, in felix humero cum apparuit alto Balteus on the next line, this baldric, the sword girdle that Turnus is wearing, that he took from Pallas, and the kind of spoils of war, and this wonderful phrase that Aeneas then uses, the spoliis meorum, of my own, right? Of the ones who were in my care that had been passed over to me. You think you can stand there wearing their stripped armor and receive mercy? It's not to be. Pallas wounds you. Pallas te hoc vulnere, Pallas immolat, et poenem sceleratex sanguine sumit. it's impossible to do full justice to the Latin here. It's blood curdling. It's incredibly powerful, and it has made many people very uncomfortable. Um, Not because there aren't scenes of brutality in Homer. This is actually quite similar to how Achilles responds when Hector kind of presents himself in objection the way Turnus did. There's a famous line in book 20 of the Iliad when Achilles says, "Don't talk of oaths to me. Lions and men make no contracts, nor are wolves and lambs in sympathy." Otherwise, in other words, you and I have no more business than a predator and its prey, right? I am a beast, and you've made me into a lion, and now I'm going to consume and destroy you. And there's no civilization between us. All of that has completely broken down, and there's only war and savagery and violence. So that is very much, I think, in the background here. And yet, at the same time, there are also in the Iliad what are sometimes called Homer's palliatives, which is to say, after the brutality of that encounter between Hector and Achilles, there's all the stuff I was just talking about. There's Priam, there's grief, there's the relenting of Achilles when he lets Hector's body be buried. And the end of the poem, the resolution of the Iliad, comes when they buried Hector, breaker of horses, right? That's the last line of the poem. And that is meant to round it out and to bring a close to this story of rage. None of that is here. There's also not the kind of moderation that we get in the Odyssey. If you remember the end of that poem, there was a scene of brutality again and bloodshed and gore at the end when Odysseus slaughters the suitors who have been tormenting his wife and ravaging his home in his absence. But even there's a very delicate kind of negotiation that goes on between Odysseus and Telemachus and some of the peripheral figures who have gotten swept up in the evil of the suitors. One of the things that Odysseus is clearly learning there is how to manage a household justly again and moderate his war fury. And at the end of that poem is the reintegration of Odysseus into home life. He has to go and plant an oar in a land where they've never seen the sea, so they don't know what they're looking at. They think it's a threshing fan, right? That poem, too, gives us the horror of the brutality, but then it also rounds it out and kind of draws it down and gives us this picture of moderation or of catharsis, right? All of that is a very big part of Homer and a very big part of the epic tradition. If that's what you were expecting, and we are kind of led to expect that by Turnus, this is extremely shocking. This is Aeneas seeming to lose control altogether. And so, if you wanted to make the case that Virgil was actually a subversive, that he didn't believe Augustan Rome was any good, and that he couldn't outright denounce it, but he was going to praise it in such a way that careful readers could see actually this is a kind of brutal reign of thuggery, right? This is just the destruction of our republic by this autocrat, this tyrant. If you were going to make that case, this ending would seem like really good ammunition for that. It's like taking all of the parts of Homer that we're led to expect and cutting away everything except for the violence, except for the gore. So let's talk about some of the possibilities here, right? This is a much debated, much discussed passage. I am going to tell you my take, but I'm also going to try to give you some of the possible approaches. Obviously, people are going to keep debating this forever, and we're not going to resolve it here, but I do have a definite opinion about what's going on. One possibility, of course, we've already mentioned, this is not how the poem was supposed to end. Virgil had other ideas, other plans for how he was going to introduce Virgil's palliatives, right? To mirror Homer's palliatives. And no, Turnus doesn't get to live, just like Hector doesn't get to live, but maybe there was going to be a funeral, or maybe there were going to be scenes like the ones that end the Iliad to give us some sense that Rome is now going to be put in order. Because the natural sort of denouement here would be a picture of the well-run state. Of course, Aeneas is now going to transition out of being the warrior into being the statesman and the king. And we should think of him as the just manager of the household, kind of a beautiful fusion, right, of Achilles and Odysseus at their final moments in the poems. And now all of that is going to become embodied in the founder of Rome or something, right? I'm just spinning it out in my head here, but that is what Virgil could have done maybe if he lived. And we know that Virgil wasn't satisfied with the poem, that it was preserved against his wishes, or at least so we're told. And so maybe this was kind of where the not where the poem was ultimately supposed to end. And this is one reason why he was so upset about it. It does not end. The poem does not end on one of the many unfinished lines. We've talked throughout this series about the lines in which the poem kind of ends before the meter should be carried out, right? That doesn't happen here. We do have a complete line at the end, but still, right? If it's such a jagged ending, such a kind of shocker cliffhanger, maybe we would think, well, this was supposed to be kind of rounded out at the end and smoothed over. Other possibilities include this is where it was supposed to end. Virgil conveniently died before he could suffer the consequences, but he did write an ending which Augustus would have looked at and been appalled, right? If Augustus thought this was supposed to be the ending, he would have been horrified at the portrait of him as a kind of brutal, unforgiving murderer. Some evidence for that might include, well, Augustus was famous for his clementia. He prided himself on showing mercy in situations where he could potentially execute his enemies. And that was a major part of his regime, his self-portrayal, the way that he presented himself as the bringer of peace after years of civil war. Rome had gone through decades, 100 years of different rulers and autocrats basically jockeying for control and executing their enemies ruthlessly. We talked about the proscriptions and the civil wars and the rivers of Rome, the streets of Rome running red with blood, right? Ever since Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, now here comes Augustus, Octavian, right? The bringer of peace, the offerer of clemency. So perhaps this was undermining that portrayal, right? Maybe Augustus would have looked at this and thought, how dare this poet portray me as a villain, right? Portray me as somebody that doesn't listen to pleas for mercy. On the other hand, right, arguing against that is the fact that, as we've discussed, it's only us moderns who have raised the possibility that the Aeneid is anti-Augustus. And at the time, so far as we can tell, people thought, actually, this is pretty pro-Augustus, right? This is a monument to Augustus' glory, as well as to Rome and to its history and its destiny and all of that. So it would be kind of odd, right? If this poem were, in fact, if this ending were so obviously anti-Augustus, but nobody thought to pick up on it until the modern day, right? And that is the hardest thing for what they call pessimists to deal with, right? If you do think that this poem is a secret anti-Augustan screed, you have to explain why nobody seems to have noticed that at the time. And there were plenty of subversive and clever ways of getting at emperors that people did notice. It's not like there was only ever pro-imperial literature under the emperors. There were all sorts of critiques and subtle digs and jabs. But Virgil was not counted among those who were famous for issuing them. And so the other possibility, the third one that I want us to grapple with, and ultimately the one that I want to go for, is that this very much is how Virgil intended for the poem to end. He didn't leave it unfinished in this respect. The shock of the ending, the intensity of the ending is all intentional, and Augustus would have been delighted. We today look at this act of violence, this killing, and we have the typical reaction of modern people who have lived at the end of many, many centuries of Christianity in the West, and who have modern values and who don't like to see people die, and who don't have a lot of direct experience necessarily with warfare, at least not of the kind that they practiced in the ancient world, and who have all sorts of new sensitivities which have often been brought to bear upon this poem as part of the pessimistic reading. But, in fact, if you were, say, a Roman emperor and you were looking at this poem, it wouldn't actually strike you as merciless. It wouldn't strike you as unnecessarily gory or violent. I think it would actually strike you as a perfectly calibrated scale tipping over to the execution of Turnus and a perfect blending and balance of justice and mercy. So here's why I think that. Okay, we see the death of Turnus, we see the worthless life scurrying to the Shadowlands, and we think, gosh, that's a bit harsh, isn't it? Um, and we see Aeneas kind of maybe holding back, contemplating showing mercy, raising the question, is this a time when clementia should be shown? But I think what one of the things Virgil is doing is he's showing Aeneas weighing those possibilities, taking them very seriously, even in the heat of anger, not letting his emotions get the better of him, but pausing to deliberate rationally, and then deciding upon the sight of the baldric, no, in fact, the rage is what needs its time to burn here in this moment. This is the appropriate time for death, for killing, and that later on will be a time for mercy. Let's look again at what happens, right? Aeneas is kind of suspended in a sense of maybe kind of mercy. Then he sees the baldric, right? He sees that this is a person who has killed his ward, who was under his protection, and remembers that this is also the person who has stirred up the war in the first place, right? Who has caused this dissent and tension between the Trojans and the Rutulians that has made it impossible to have a peaceful founding of Rome. And he slays him on Pallas's behalf, right? The rage that he is feeling is not allowed just to go indiscriminately, but is rather channeled toward this sacrifice. And it's presented in exactly that way, right? Pallas slaughters you as sacrifice and punishment. He immolat et poenam sceleratex sanguine sumit. He takes your blood, right, as punishment for the crime. This is an act of justice. This is Virgil showing harsh justice and the kind of justice that is required to establish peace and order. After that establishment has been made, after you have peace through strength, then you can show mercy. But remember, what was it that Anchises, Aeneas' father, said was going to be the art of the Romans, right? Their special craft, the way Greeks have rhetoric and sculpture, the way, say, Babylonian astronomers can chart the stars. The art of the Roman is debellare superbos et parcere subjectis, to spare the conquered and to battle down the proud. And what's going on in this scene is a very, very delicate weighing on the scales of whether Turnus is one of the proud who needs to be beaten down, or one of the kind of abject, one of the humble and the subjected, one of the people who has been conquered and can now be spared. And Turnus is representing himself as one of the humble, right? One of those who has been conquered. Look, you've got everything you want from me, right? You have my surrender. You have Lavinia, the woman who will be your wife, right? You have the kingship and the leadership and everything. Everyone sees me now surrendering to you. So shouldn't he be one of the ones who is given mercy? And we might think in the modern day, yeah, totally, like spare him, right? This for the founder of an ancient civilization, right, who has to bring a final close to this era of war, just the way Augustus represented himself as bringing that final close. Mark Antony, the final rebel, could never have been allowed to live. In the event, he killed himself, right? But Augustus could never have carried on as emperor of Rome while Antony, the rival, was still alive. And in fact, right, the conspirators who killed Caesar, not just Antony, but everyone that was involved, including like minor poets who were who were content to flee, right? They were all hunted down and killed. And I don't think that the Augustan Roman, the Roman who loves Augustus and wants to praise him, would think of that as excessive. In fact, that was what it took to button up the era of civil war, to bring a final decisive closing to this era of constant retribution. Yes, Augustus was known for clemency, but first of all, he was known for bringing an end to civil war. And to do that, you have to hunt down and kill everybody who still carries forward the enemy regime in him, right? It's incredibly gruesome and gory, and it's definitely something that makes us uncomfortable. But I think Virgil is saying that's what Augustus did by hunting down the conspirators who killed Julius Caesar and by ultimately beating Antony in war. And that's what had to be done in order to put an end to this cycle of violence that we were trapped in. Augustus was the only one who could bring that authoritative end. And it was because he did that that then he could show mercy. And that's what Aeneas is doing here too. Virgil puts Aeneas in exactly the position he needs him in so that he can weigh the possibility of sparing Turnus, who has caused this war, and then decide, seeing that he's still wearing the spoils of the war and the spoils of the victim of the war in Pallas, right? Seeing that, he knows that in order to bring an end and to bring peace and justice, he's going to have to execute. Somebody's blood has to be spilled for Pallas' blood to balance this out and close out this chapter, and Turnus is the one. And brilliantly, Virgil has Aeneas do it, yes, in anger, but not because of anger. He gives a very carefully reasoned, logical explanation for why he's doing it, and that is, you have killed somebody who was in my care. And so, yes, we might think, okay, Aeneas is just becoming the rageful Achilles in this moment, but he actually is very subtly surpassing Achilles because he's killing on behalf of those that he was in charge of. Maiorum, right? Of my own people, right? The ones that were given into my care. And that's what Augustus also wants to portray himself as being, the father of his country, right? The protector of the innocent. And so when Aeneas sees that and says, you are wearing the spoils of my own, he transitions out of personal violence and retribution, out of personal rage, and into rage on behalf of his subjects, on behalf of the people whose safety he is in charge of. And that is why Pallas gives you this wound, right? He passes it off onto Pallas symbolically. It's the dead innocent who comes back from the grave and slaughters Turnus, just as Augustus, in putting an end to civil war and killing the conspirators and taking over as the father of his country, as the new emperor, right? He passed out of being one of the participants in the civil war, right? Out of his personal capacity as a competitor in this back and forth, and into his regal state capacity as the executor of justice. We think of this as like a merciless killing. It's actually the final blow that Aeneas has to strike in order to become the person that can rule Rome and to become the person that perfectly mirrors all of Augustus' virtues. When we look at how Augustus himself talked about his own virtues, right? Again, he did often remind people that he spared them when he could have not spared them. And there's a famous monument called the Res Gestae Divi Augusti, the deeds or the acts, the things done by the divine Augustus, that is kind of an imperial decree, right? It's a statement that Augustus issued about the things that he's done. It survives, portions of it survive in what is now Turkey. And so we can read kind of Augustus' own PR. And he does say, especially in talking about the Battle of Actium, when he beat his rivals and beat Mark Antony's forces, right? He says, wars, both civil and foreign, I undertook throughout the world on sea and land. Hint, hint, Actium was a sea battle. And when victorious, I spared all citizens who sued for pardon. So this is parcere subiectis, right? This is to spare the conquered. The foreign nations which could with safety be pardoned, I preferred to save rather than to destroy. Key word there being with safety, right? The foreign nations which could with safety be pardoned. And so there is just the whisper of a hint there, even as he's saying, I spared the conquered, right? There's a whisper of, and I also beat down the proud, de bellare superbos, right? And those two things are combined in Augustus' self-presentation always, right? He was not somebody that wanted to portray himself as a pushover, but rather as a person who had so much strength that he could then proceed to show mercy. And this is something that he says he was celebrated for. Later on in the Res Gestae, there's a famous moment in which the Senate, uh, by decree of the Senate, I was given the title of Augustus, and the doorposts of my house were covered with laurels by public act, and a civic crown was fixed above my door, and a golden shield was placed in the Curia Julia. This is the Senate house that was established by Julius Caesar in 44 BC. The inscription, this shield was placed in the Senate house. Its inscription testified that the Senate and the Roman people gave me this in recognition of my valor, my clemency, my justice, and my piety. So not just clementia, but virtus, virtus first, right? Strength, manliness, aggression, virtus, then clementia, then mercy, then justitia, then justice, then pietas, then piety. And those four things are in very definitive order, right? First, peace through strength. First, I show that I can bring an end to war by battling down the proud. Then I show that I am not simply vindictive like those other civil warriors, but actually have clementia, right? Will show mercy to those who could otherwise be rightfully executed by the state. Now the situation is right for me to show justitia, justice, right? To organize and order the state after having wiped the slate clean with valor and clemency, and then pietas, right? And then the respect for divine and sacred things that will cap off this entire thing. Those four virtues are the virtues that Aeneas has to show in order to be an Augustan hero. And I think that by driving home this final blow into Turnus' chest, he basically begins what will become a story of valor, clemency, justice, and piety. He has to show this final act of aggression so that then he can spare, presumably afterward, the other Rutulians. Then he can show justice and piety and found the civilization that will become Rome. That, I think, is what Virgil meant by this ending. I think it is not unplanned in the slightest. I don't think there's even the chance. Virgil being who he is and the artist that he was, with this incredibly careful and very daring and innovative style that he had, he knew just what he was doing with this ending. Now, that doesn't mean it's not incredibly shocking, right? Of course, we all read this and think, whoa, that was a heck of an ending. And ancient readers would have thought that too. Just because they might not have been as disgusted by the violence as some modern readers are, they would certainly have been shocked by this. But they also wouldn't be totally unused to the idea of an abrupt ending. There were other epics after Homer. I'm thinking, for example, of the Argonautica by Apollonius of Rhodes, which is another big model for Virgil, ends rather abruptly. So it's not like that in itself would have been an argument that it wasn't complete. And I think when the shock had hit and the Romans understood what they had just heard in the ending or read in the ending, it would have been like a shocked silence followed by riotous applause, because this is what Virgil is doing. He's saying, yes, it is brutal. It is severe. It is something that Aeneas had to grow into over 12 books of this poem to be ready to carry out this execution and then move forward with creating this civilization. But that's the hero he's become, and that's the hero we have in Augustus. Yes, it's brutal. Yes, there are violent moments in it, but it is worth it, right? That's what C.S. Lewis said about this poem, right? It's a burden, it's a cost, it's painful and difficult, and every moment of it is worth it. That's what I think. You let me know what you think. I am fascinated by this ending. If you think it was unintended, or if you think it's more anti-Augustus than you might suspect, then I think, let me know. As always, Virgil is giving us double or triple vision, right? He is showing us all the negatives, all the costs, and yet he's also showing us the glory. And I think this ending is kind of perfect, note perfect for that. And certainly without a doubt, this journey that I've taken with you, this series that we've done together, has been worth it for me. All of the effort is well worth it. I hope it was worth it for you too. I hope that you have come to love this poem or gained a newfound love for the poem you already knew. Wherever you are at with that, however you began this series, I'm so grateful to you for coming with me on this journey. And we will continue on to new pastures now. I'm going to do some medieval English literature for the rest of the year. Fall and early winter to me is just time to read medieval English literature. So that's what I'm going to do. And then after that, thank you all for your various notes and messages about what we should do next. I am delighted to say that when the new year begins, we will be doing a new series on Dante's Divine Comedy, an enormous and rich text. And that'll be next year. But we have a little bit of time before the year ends to cover some shorter works, and it's going to be medieval English literature to close out the year. But first, one more time before we go, it figures. One of my favorite parts of this series has been doing figures of speech with you, telling you about different ways that poets and rhetoricians use language and different ways that the scholars who study these sorts of things have categorized these uses of language that poets come up with. And there is one figure of speech which is less perhaps famous or well known than some of the others we've talked about, but also we can't close out the Aeneid without talking about prolepsis. It's something that Virgil uses all the time, and it comes from the Greek word prolambanein, meaning to take before. So maybe from that you can guess that prolepsis is a kind of anticipation. And one of the things that has been a running theme for me in this series is, in some ways, all of the Aeneid is prolepsis. It is this future history, right? It's things that haven't yet happened being portrayed as if they already have, and it's this kind of layering of past, present, and future over one another. But prolepsis proper, that is the specific thing that we call prolepsis, has a slightly more narrow meaning, and that is either in rhetoric when you anticipate somebody's objection and you answer it, right? I know what you're going to say, but, right? That's prolepsis, right? I know that you're going to tell me, well, if we tell YouTube how to host content, then how can we be sure that the government won't censor conservatives? I know that that's going to be your objection, but let me tell you, right, if I'm anticipating that objection, that's rhetorical prolepsis. But poetical prolepsis is something even, I think, more subtle and sophisticated, and that is talking about future things as if they had already happened. He was a dead man when he walked into the room, right? Obviously, he walked into the room, so he wasn't dead, but he was already dead, meaning it was as good as done. There are many moments in Virgil's Aeneid in which that is what's going on, where the things that are to come are kind of embodied in the here and now. And that's part of the poem's sense of the future is already present for us, right? We are, as we live out the future, always thinking about or almost kind of living through how future generations will see us. And that's something that all statesmen involved in a great endeavor do. At a much more mundane level, right, there is a little tiny moment of prolepsis in the section that I translated for you this week, when Turnus says, Lavinia is your wife, tua Lavinia conjunx, right? She's already your wife. She's as good as married to you, right? You've got her, right? Tua est. The wedding, the marriage is still to come, but he's saying it's a done deal, right? There's nothing now that can happen to pull that back. And so she is your conjunx. That's prolepsis, right? That's anticipating the thing which is now certain to happen, even if it hasn't already happened yet. With that in mind, rather than doing a mailbag question, usually at rejoiceevermore.substack.com, I take mailbag questions. I have a lot that I'm excited to answer. But since this is our last episode on the Aeneid, and since I've just done It Figures about prolepsis, I thought I would sum up just a few things that I've taken from this reading of the Aeneid. There's no such thing as a moral, by the way. If you're ever trying to read a great work and you're like, what is the meaning of this poem, right? Sometimes in English class, we were told to like come up with the moral or say the message, right? That was another word that we got a lot in English class. This was a very silly way for them to teach us how to read. There's no such thing as a one-sentence moral of a story or a message of a poem, because the message is the poem, right? And if the author could have said the moral or the message in just a sentence or two, then they wouldn't have had to write the poem, right? Good poems are there because you need the whole thing to give you the whole picture. But each time you come back to a poem, you draw different things out of it. And I do think that this time, reading it with you in this moment that we're living through, which is in many ways akin to the Augustan moment, right? We've lived through a turbulent time. Now we seem to be embarking on a kind of new American venture. Trump does seem to want to do a kind of restoration, whatever you think about that. There are some ways in which he is kind of an Augustus figure a little bit. Be that as it may, whatever it is, I have come to a few thoughts just to close us out here. The first one I already mentioned, and that is great things have a cost, right? We, I think, have lived for too long in a fantasy where you can achieve greatness without breaking any eggs, right? Always, and especially in moments of transition, there are going to be difficult and hard choices that people have to make. When you build anything worthwhile, when you build a family, you have to make the hard choice to give up, to forsake all others, as the marriage vows say, right? When you build a nation, you have to defend its borders, right? This is another thing that we've fantasized away recently, but nations to exist need borders. Borders require some hard muscle to enforce, right? Great things have a cost, but if they're truly great, they are worth it. In fact, that's how you know, right? Is that you feel compelled to pay the cost because of the vision of what's coming in the future. The next thing about that future is that it's always open-ended, right? One of the things that Virgil does, and I've noticed this for the first time, is he gives you a picture of, yes, there's prolepsis. Yes, we know that the end is sort of written, right? We've read the Iliad. We know that Rome is coming. And yet he constantly reminds us that in the moment, the future is open-ended. It depends on our actions. And I think he's doing that both to immerse us deeper into the story, but also to remind us that we might be living our own Aeneid right now, right? This is our saga. Your life is your saga. And it may be that the ending is somehow written, but you are writing it as you go, right? So even if you believe in fate, even if you believe in destiny, the way that destiny manifests is in your free choice of the will. And yet, right, you can trust, and this is the thing that makes this poem almost, to me, a Christian poem, and Virgil, an almost Christian author. History has a design, right? There is a holy plan running through this poem that is higher even than Zeus. And it's almost like we can't quite look directly at it. We don't quite understand it, but it's governing the whole story. And if we live into it, as Aeneas frequently does, right? If you live into the plan, if you believe that there is somewhere for you to go, a destiny, then it becomes real as you do it, right? That was that famous speech that he made. One day it may please us even to remember these things, right? Virgil tells us that Aeneas made that speech when he didn't believe it. He didn't feel in his heart that everything was going to be okay, that they were going to win. And yet he said it anyway because it was part of the plan. And by saying it and by living into it and by that faith, right, by that belief, it became true. History has a design, and yet the choice of how to live it out is in your hands. Pay the cost of great things. If I have nothing else to say to you out of this series, take that with you as you go. And that will be the end of our time with the Aeneid. It's been a joy. I hope you'll stick with me now as we go forth into some medieval English literature for the fall, and then into Dante's Divine Comedy, which I'm very, very excited to start with you in the new year. But for now, I will remind you just that rejoiceevermore.substack.com is where you can get my other writing and a bunch of other things that you might find of interest, weekly essays. There are some paid features, and if you want to support me, that's a great way to do it. I would really appreciate if any of you want to become paid subscribers. And you can be in the mailbag. You can write to me on the DMs, which we will pick back up next time. Check out my book, Light of the Mind, Light of the World. Rate this podcast 5 stars, share it around, let people know. That's how we keep the lights on, keep things going. As always, I remain enormously grateful to all of you for going with me on this nerdy, vigorous, glorious journey. And I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.